Welcome to Paint with me in Krita, and today we're going to talk about blending as you use it for shading of your paintings. This video will go through a number of techniques for doing hard and soft edge shading, but I'll also save them as separate videos in the Krita how-to playlist so that you can reference them individually later if you need to. So the really tricky part of shading that you're going to have to figure out and learn is, how do I create this blended or this smooth type of transition? And the answer to that comes down to two things: some techniques and then also the type of brush that you use. Now, if you're doing cell shading, you can just use a hard round brush. So for example, here I've got 10 of the top brushes for hard edge. You might use the basic 5 size, but for the beginning shading you want to start with the airbrush soft. For textured shading, I would suggest that you use pencil 6 quick shade or perhaps pencil 3 large 4B. The other approach that you can use is just use a hard edge and then come back and use an eraser like the eraser soft to soften the edge. Now, if you're new to digital painting, you may think that you can just take these specialized brushes and just paint right on there, and that can work, especially if you've got lots of experience, but really you probably want to know about blenders. Those will work especially when you have a smooth shading, but if you're trying to do texture, they can be a little bit difficult to work with, so there's other techniques that I'll explain in a minute. But I would propose, if you want a very smooth, soft blending, then you want to use the blender blur. If you want something that's closer to a harder edge but not completely hard, then you might want to use the blender basic. So let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. I will turn off this shades layer and turn the flats back on and just walk you through the process a little bit. So I'm just going to create a new layer, set it to multiply, and I'll call it Shades 2. To do ambient shading, first I'm going to use a magic wand tool to control the area that I shade. I'm going to make sure that all layers are selected, and then I'm going to just click on the background. That will then select the entire region outside of the face. Then I'm going to go to Select and invert the selection. Now that allows me to shade just within this face region. I'll select my brush. I'm going to select a soft airbrush and select a brush tool. Now I select a color that I want to use for shading. So here I'm using the same color for the entire face. You could choose a region based upon the flesh tones or the hair. Now I just lightly press and start that shading, and then where I want it to be darker, I darken it up. I use that exact same process for highlights, except for I don't want to put it on the shades layer because that's got a multiply blend. I want to have it in its own layer, such as highlights, that uses a normal blending mode. So let's talk about hard and soft shading in this picture here. So I am going to go back to the Shades level 2. I'm going to use the magic wand to select the area because I'm going to shade in this jaw area. I'm going to make sure that all layers are selected, and I'm just going to click in that area. So now as I do my shading, it will be constrained to be just on this face. To create a soft edge shadow, I'm going to select the airbrush soft and just change the brush size to whatever thickness of the shadow that I want to work with. I've used a selection to mask off the area, and then I can just draw in the picture here and shade how I want. I can press very lightly to create a light area and use pen pressure just to control that how I like. To create texture shaded, you can use a tool such as Pencil 6 Quick Shade, and then just use the pen pressure to control the amount of shading that you have. And if you've done a little bit too much, you can press E to turn that tool into an eraser and soften up that edge. To create a hard edge shadow, I select a brush that has a hard edge, such as basic 5 size, and then I just paint into the area that I want. to turn a hard edge into a soft edge. I can use a blender. So for example, I'll select this blender blur, and I change the size of the brush to whatever I think is appropriate, and I can blend to get something that is close to a hard edge but not as hard as an actual hard edge brush. I can use the basic blender. And you can see I can come in, and it's a little bit harder than that soft blur. I can also use the eraser soft and erase an edge, and so get a softer edge that's even a little bit, maybe even a little bit harder than the basic blender. This next technique I'm going to describe is blending using a color picker, and it's not as important with Krita because Krita has some excellent brushes and methods of blending, but in many tutorials they describe this approach because some other paint programs don't blend nearly as well. And for certain brushes in Krita you may also want to use this technique. So for this illustration I'm going to use the marker Chisel Smooth, and I'm going to select a color that's fairly dark compared to this flesh tone. And as I draw here, I start off very dark, and I'm going to now try to blend that in by lightly letting off the pressure of the brush. And you can see what we get is these kind of hard edges, and it doesn't really blend very well. Now, Krita is extremely powerful, and so I actually have to show you something about the color picker first. So I'm going to go to the color picker, and then I'm going to look at the color picker options. And the thing that you want to pay attention to is blend. Most paint programs do not have this kind of option, and so when I pick a color, it goes completely to that color that I'm over. But in Krita, I can actually blend that color. So in Krita, you actually wouldn't use this technique so much because you would blend to get a better way of doing this. But most paint programs, they have it all the way up, and so I'm going to show you what that looks like because that's how many tutorials will teach it. So with my blend set to 100, I'm going to go back to the paintbrush, and now I'm going to, if I come over the dark color and press Control and click, now you see that it has selected that color. If I go over the light color and click, now you see it has selected that color, and that's the thing that we're going to deal with. And if I go to a little bit lighter area, you'll see that it picks up whatever color you're hovering over. So this is a little bit of a challenging and tedious process, but it can help you, and it may be appropriate for different situations. So to show it a little bit more clearly, I'm going to choose a color that is really a strong color, and I'm going to draw very strongly here. And you can see there's a very big difference between these two different colors. So to blend this edge, I'm going to move over a little bit, and I'm going to use very light pressure and lay down a stroke. Now notice with this particular pen, if I lay down a second stroke, it darkens it up a little bit. So we're getting a little bit of a better transition here. So then what I'll do is I'll come over to the left, and I will press Control, and I will pick up the lighter color. And so when I put the stroke down here, now you'll notice it lightens up even the darker stroke. And so what I do then is I will click here to get that intermediate color and paint down here. And so I kind of go back and forth clicking the different colors to try to lighten or darken different areas depending upon what I need. Going back and forth to get that transition. And so that's the process. Like I said, it's a bit tedious, but that can be helpful depending upon the kind of brush that you're using in Krita. And so one of the key points is if you're watching tutorials from other paint programs about blending, Krita is much more powerful. So that's one real reason to use Krita. It's a great program. So that wraps up the video about shading or blending techniques in Krita. I hope you've enjoyed it and enjoy painting.